Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Rules are a fundamental part of every religion, rules that bear on every aspect of human existence. But the nature of those rules varies between the different religions. Many have at least a few dietary laws, but some really go overboard on what you may or may not eat and drink, and even sometimes even how you do so. For example, Christianity really only has dietary rules about things that affect your mind, alcohol being the only one that's mentioned in the Bible, but Christian tradition will usually expand on that list and include things like hallucinogenic mushrooms and other such drugs. Judaism, on the other hand, has an incredibly complex set of dietary laws. No shrimp, no clams, no pigs, no rabbits, no predatory birds, no blood, no insects. You can't eat certain cuts of beef. That was new to me. They can only have cuts from the front half of the animal. You can only eat meat that has been ritually slaughtered in a way that is certified kosher. You can't cook meat with milk, and the list goes on and on. Other religions cut out meat entirely or even go completely vegan. So a very diverse attitude toward eating and drinking. What about dead bodies? Some religions don't allow cremation, but some require it, while another prefers to let wild birds eat the body, and many say nothing at all about the matter. The Amish are totally against technology, while most other religions fully embrace it. So a diversity of responses to various aspects of basic human existence. But when it comes to our sexuality and gender, every religion has something to say about that. I'm not aware of any religion that does not say anything in one way or another about sex. How about you, Scott? Can you name one?
No, I couldn't. Certainly not off the top of my head. I'm sure we could find one, but but I think, I think in general.
I'm not sure we can find one because I think that would stand out.
No, it very well may. Because I mean, we may find some that are very, what we would call in Western society, very liberal about sexuality, but there's still a focus on sexuality.
So not only can I not think of religions that don't have something to say which is negative about sex, there's even religions that they even include sex in their religious practices. So whether it's pro or anti-sex, I think every religion on the planet today have something to say one way or the other on sex.
Which really, in a sense, isn't that surprising, given that how fundamental sex is to our nature, right? As humans.
That's why I made the point about dietary laws. Like, what could be more fundamental than eating and drinking?
Right.
And yet some religions say, no, not this and not that, but only this. And whereas others really say, yeah, fine, go ahead, whatever you want, just go ahead.
Right. Good point.
Now, while Christianity can be fairly lenient and open-minded about almost every other point, it really becomes incredibly legalistic about any and every aspect of sexuality and gender. And a lot of the major headline-grabbing scandals in protests in the news, if it involves Christians, it usually involves sexuality and gender.
I think one thing that maybe is worth distinguishing is kind of the phenomenology of religion versus maybe even the Bible itself. So what I mean by that is that in our discourse, in our practical religious lives as Christians, Jews, Muslims, to name the three biggies, but even, Hindus and others, phenomenologically, there is a lot of focus on sexuality, even though I'm not sure that that's is much of a focus if you actually look at the Bible. Like if you look at the Bible at what percentage of it is focused on that issue, I don't think you'd find it particularly high or even as high as other issues such as, justice issues and love of neighbor and those kinds of things. I mean, it's very much there, but it's much more there in the practical, in the way that we have lived out our religious lives. We make it front and center. I'm not sure Jesus did. I'm not sure that the gospel writers did. It doesn't seem to be their major issue.
That's why I wanted to do this series. I wanted to know, why is this such a focus, a fixation for Christians in particular, over and above almost every other religion, it seems, other than Judaism, of course. And if there's good reason for that emphasis, then so be it. I can accept that. But what if our reasons for that fixation are unfounded or misplaced? So that was one of the major questions that I wanted to explore in this miniseries. One might say it's because God himself is so hyper-concerned about human sexuality and gender, but I just don't get that anymore. I'm not convinced of that. If I'm going to believe in a God that exists across multiple dimensions over astronomical distances, and down to the subatomic realm, and every conceivable layer of consciousness and knowledge, it just seems to me that human sexuality wouldn't be at the very top or near the top of his concerns about us. I think it would be much lower on the divine priority scale than, say, for example, how we deal with poverty and abuse and war and even, I mean, we're going through this climate crisis, even planetary environmental destruction. I think that would be more important. Think about the blasé attitude that many dog owners have when they watch their dogs humping other dogs or even tree stumps or even their owner's legs. Those owners will just brush it off saying, yeah, that's just what dogs do. And they might
Yeah.
roll their eyes, but they don't make it their top priority to control and regulate that. And so I just have to wonder, why would God do so?
Well, that is an interesting analogy, and it's interesting too, kind of based on what you're saying there, that as far as sexual ethics go, we're the only animal that has them in a sense, right? There's no sexual ethics for dogs, and
Right.
animals just reproduce, and we accept that. In fact, we know from studies of various apes and things like that there's rape in those settings. There's homosexuality. There's pretty much the whole variety of sexual expression that we find in humans. But we don't make ethical judgments on that. We just kind of say, well, that's what they are. They're just acting out their biology. When it comes to humans, on the other hand, we take a very different tack. So that in itself, I find interesting.
Yeah, totally.
But that's even a bigger question. I mean, ethics. We are Homo ethicus, right? Like human beings believe in right and wrong. Of course, C.S. Lewis wrote a famous essay on that. But so that leads into that whole discussion. But it is an interesting one, I think.
Right. On this question of why would God take interest in this subject to the degree that we say he does, I found it interesting. I stumbled across an article a few weeks ago when we were preparing for this episode. The journal was Woman Alive, and the title was basically, Does God Watch Me Having Sex? And the article was basically, while I'm having sex with my husband, is God watching me? And
what a way to ruin your sex life.
yeah, really, eh? Okay, so in the last few weeks, then, we've looked at why Christians can get so animated over this issue. And inevitably, we made this point several times, but I think it just has to be hammered home. The justification for this involves pointing to Old Testament passages, especially the first 5 books of the Bible, or to New Testament passages that themselves point back to those same Old Testament passages. And the people who are doing this, they'll use peculiar words from those passages that they really don't understand. They can't define, like abomination or fornication. If you're asked to define those things, I have a feeling the average person certainly couldn't, according to Webster's dictionary. And they'll use phrases that they can't really explain either, like the image of God. There's a diversity of opinions on what that means. Or the phrase, the body being a temple, the physical body being a spiritual temple. Or the phrase, two people being made one flesh. And despite all the fog around those words and phrases, they'll refer to those passages because they feel those capture God's own perspective on the question.
Yeah, boy, if there's ever an area for proof texting, what theologians call proof texting, which is basically bringing together verses to make a point. It's something that's very commonly done, and in this area, very commonly done, where they'll pick and choose certain verses and things and base a whole understanding of sexuality on those things. And I think it's highly problematic, and it's led to a lot of the misuse and, frankly, abuse of particularly women, but others as well in this whole area.
And we're going to talk exactly about that in a few minutes. What we found, we've done that investigating, that exploring, and what we found over the last 4 episodes is that when you look at the entire context in which those passages are found, and you make some effort to learn about how those ancient books came into existence, unless you begin with a certain definition of inspiration that sounds more like divine dictation and presuppositions like inerrancy and infallibility, if you step back and look at them comprehensively and objectively, then you really have to start seeing those passages as coming out of the values and worldviews of ancient Semitic men, rather than coming from a cosmic, eternal, divine being.
Oh, I think very much so. And, I think as you're talking, I think in particular of a situation, for example, in the Abrahamic accounts, where, very casually, you have Abraham giving Sarah to the Egyptian pharaoh, right? Because he's afraid, right? But there's not a lot of talk in there about how horrific a thing that is like, the
Right,
fact that he obviously felt he just owned her and she was like a piece of property that he could lend,
right,
like it. And so, yeah, so it reflects, yeah, a whole patriarchal kind of understanding and worldview. And that's what those writers, and I think we definitely have to contextualize that, to understand what's going on there, and to build a theology out of that. It's obviously very dangerous. I mean, this is how they justified slavery in the southern states for years, by not contextualizing that
right.
whole issue, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we did the 4 episodes. We got scholars on board. We always want to talk to scholars in our episodes because these are people who have studied a particular subject for decades. They've looked at it from every angle, or at least many angles that most people wouldn't think to look at. And they get their ideas critiqued by other scholars in related areas. So that's why we always aim for scholars. And I have to say, it was not easy getting Christian scholars who would speak to this issue of the Christian response to sexuality and gender. In fact, it was the most difficult interview to set up, or set of interviews, in all of the 120 episodes that we've done. I normally don't have to contact more than 3 or 4 people before I get someone to agree to be our guest. But for this topic, every week or two, I would contact 3 or 4 more people, all of them with the necessary expertise in Christian theology and biblical Old Testament interpretation. And I kept contacting more and more experts. And I think my last count was 23 fully qualified scholars from reputable universities and colleges. And some of them, roughly a quarter of them, initially showed interest in being interviewed, but then for whatever reason, they changed their mind. But that having been said, we did manage to talk to 2 excellent scholars with evangelical Christian theological training. And in fact, the first one, Dr. Stephen Simpson, he teaches human sexuality at Fuller Theological Seminary. So he was a perfect guest for this, and so was Sarah. We'll talk about her in a moment. But Scott, the one thing I want to talk to you about is one of the things that Steve said was that the Bible is actually very supportive of sex. And I'm not convinced, even though I've just said that he is the expert, I can't say that I'm convinced that the Bible is actually supportive of sex. Outside of the book of Song of Songs, and maybe a couple other exceptions. Otherwise, I see the Bible as very negative, very judgmental, and controlling about sexuality and gender. What do you think?
Yeah, and I can understand that. I mean, it's, to say the Bible is anything is kind of almost problematic, right? Because the Bible's a big book. It's not a big book; it's many books, and to try to give some sort of grand kind of, this is what the overall thing, I think that's tricky. But I guess it's your perspective, right? There are a lot of negative things about sex in the Bible. I think more on the phenomenological side, in other words, sexual practices, right? Things that went on. There's a lot of negativity around that. On the other hand, when sex is talked about within what the Bible sees as a committed relationship, I think it is celebrated, obviously in the Song of Solomon, but in other parts of the Bible as well. So probably I'm not where you're at. I don't think, but I don't know that I would say it's pro-sex or anti-sex. It's both. It has both aspects. That's kind of where I come down. Yeah.
And that's the Bible that we're talking about. That's one source of guidance that Christians can turn to for guidance on the whole sexuality and gender thing. But we also talked to Steve about other resources that Christians can turn to. We looked at the Wesleyan quadrangle, for example, which has 4 corners, one of them being the Bible, but there's 3 others. Those are reason, Christian experience, and church tradition. And let's talk about those as well, especially the Christian experience and church tradition. During the early history of the church, the first many centuries, or let's say roughly around the first millennium, Christian society had stratified into 2 groups. There was a minority of people who committed themselves to spiritual pursuits, things like meditation and reading and studying scripture and worship, while the majority of people, the commoners, took care of all the worldly concerns of the community, things like farming and hunting and building, and reproduction, sex. For the spiritual people, sex debased them, it dirtied them spiritually, and so they supposedly abstained from that entirely. And for the commoners, sex was a duty, something that was necessary to keep the population numbers up. And we still see echoes, at least, of that aversion towards sex in Christian society today in all kinds of forms.
Yeah. This is a very complex area, right? And there's been a lot of scholarly things written on the whole attitude of Christianity to the body in particular is very
Right.
interesting. Is right. It's
Yeah.
very interesting. And it seems to, at least to oversimplify things, it seems to stem from a turn in the West, especially towards, a more Greek understanding of reality, right?
Exactly. And that's what Steve had us looking into, the fact that
Right.
it does point directly back to Greek philosophy.
Right. It seems to, yeah.
Yeah.
And particularly, you see this in a theologian like Augustine, who I think, as much as I have such great admiration for him as an intellectual and thinker, did a horrible disservice in this area to the church. It
Yes.
really, in his attitude toward sex, and
Yeah.
that definitely fed into the medieval mindset, of
Right.
only for procreation. I mean, in Augustine, to the extent where it's actually a sinful act, but you do it and then ask forgiveness, kind of thing,
Right.
and
And for those
yeah,
listeners who may not know what we mean, well, obviously it points back to Greek philosophy, and they go, I don't get how it does.
right,
It was this idea that the Greeks had that the physical, atoms and molecules, the stuff that makes up stuff, that was actually evil. That was or at
yes,
least lesser than
yes,
what makes up the spirit. The spirit is what we
yes,
all had to attain for. And unfortunately, we were trapped in physical bodies, and we had to find ways to escape the physical to enter into the celestial, the spiritual realm. And so sex it's
yeah,
physical, and it's you have to be physical to have sex. But not only is that the problem, but in the process of having sex, you make more physical. You make another baby. So now
right,
there's more physical.
right,
So
right.
that's where this aversion to sex stems directly back to Greek philosophy.
And we see a great example of this playing out in, for example, the Book of Acts with Paul when he speaks on Mars Hill. He's doing fine as long as he's hanging around in the idealistic philosophical world, but then when he gets to the resurrection, they scorn him. He's met with real scorn, and
Right.
that makes sense because resurrection of a body. Why would you want to do that?
Right.
Like, that is so alien to the Greek mindset. But Christianity really and Judaism really affirm that, and so I think it's a real shame that, especially in the Western tradition, that we took that tangent, and it's caused a lot of problems
Right.
still to this day.
So those are some of the reasons why, if you ask me, the Bible and Christian experience and church tradition, I question that they are, in fact, very supportive of sex. I think that's stretching the truth.
Well,
Um,
I think definitely, if you look at the history of Christendom and the church situations, particularly the major factor in that being Catholicism, yeah, there's I think there are real problems.
yeah,
And it's interesting that when you talk about the Wesleyan quadrilateral and so on, a lot of this comes down to the issue of authority, doesn't it? Like in the Protestant tradition, with the idea of sola scriptura, the Bible alone, Scripture alone, that happens during the Reformation. The problem with that is that many people have a different understanding of that scripture. So where's the authority?
right,
So the Catholic Church has the advantage there because they can say, well, the authority is church tradition, and ultimately it's the papacy. But Protestants don't have that out, if you want to call it that, or
Uh,
right?
for them, it's every
Yeah.
man for himself.
Yeah, well, kind of,
Yeah,
yeah. So where does that authority lie? And I think, it's simplistic. This is why there was such a big fight over the inerrancy issue in the States, particularly in the 20s to 40s, but even later again in the 60s, because the idea is that if we believe in an inerrant Bible, that solves the problem of authority, because therefore God said it and that's it, kind of thing. But that doesn't solve the
oh, not at
problem,
all.
because not even close. Because if we have an inerrant Bible, why do we have 25,000 different Protestant denominations?
Right, exactly.
So anyway,
So, despite what some will say, to me, it does not seem that the Bible or church history or Christian experience are all that positive about sex. But just the same, there still are some who will say that God created sex for us to enjoy, that He designed us for it. I've heard this many times. And Scott, you and I, perhaps crudely, we questioned the intelligence of that design. I compared it to an innovative house design that featured a special hole in the wall that, as I said a couple times, you switch the lever to the left and it connects to the oven in the kitchen. You switch the lever to the right and it connects to the bathroom toilet. And you, Scott, you quoted George Carlin asking how smart it was to run the sewer system through the kids' playground.
yeah.
And I think I even joked that this design almost looked like God was playing some kind of a cosmic joke on mankind, because he built it into this process of sex an overpowering urge to do it, as well as a long list of moral laws that prohibit us from doing it.
Yeah, well, I think, it's interesting. I think one leads to the other in a way, right? Because and this is where like a guy like, like Plato talks about this, where we have these base desires. I mean, even Freud, with the idea of the id, right? That we have these kind of fundamental base desires, and to be human is to master those desires, to somehow tame them, bring them into our service. But how do we do that? How do we control these passions? And certainly one way to do that, amongst many, is rules, right? Is rules. And then when you ground those rules in the divine, of course, it gives them tremendous authority, right? It gives them the authority to be enacted. So yeah, it's I think, what you're saying is true. And one very much leads to the other. It's the thing about sexuality, and I can only speak as a man, I guess, but it's almost, for men, I think, for many men, and again, I'll speak for myself, it's this other person lives in you, right? This urge, whatever you want to call it, but this other thing lives in you, and Seinfeld did a fabulous episode on this at one time, where Jerry is struggling with that issue, and his id is dressed as he's playing like a chess game, and his id is dressed kind of like remember that one? Yeah. His id is dressed kind of like a penis, and then his higher self is, and they're having this argument, between each other. And I think that conflict is very real. And so that for that to be expressed religiously doesn't surprise me in the least, because it's so fundamental to our humanness.
Yeah. Okay, so we're having some fun here. We're being silly, George Carlin jokes and all, at the expense of intelligent design. But I want to get serious now. I do have a problem with intelligent design for many reasons, and this is one of my biggest reasons why I'm against intelligent design. This is where I think intelligent design takes a really dark and evil twist. When you look at the ultimate outcome of this design, this whole design of sex, the ultimate outcome being childbirth. This design for sex and reproduction and childbirth inevitably means the mother has to squeeze her baby through her pelvis, through a hole that's barely big enough to accommodate the baby's head. And without modern medical intervention, what ends up happening for too many mothers and babies without medical intervention, roughly 2 or 3% of them, the outcome is an agonizing death, stretched out over hours and sometimes days, as she tries to push a baby that just will not go through that hole for one reason or another. And unless someone takes the horrible step of cutting open the dead mother, then the baby also ends up dying, basically by literally having the life squeezed out of them. And so I am sincerely sorry if this is offensive for some, but for me, this is another example why I can't adhere to the whole idea of intelligent design, that God created us in this way for this kind of thing. There's no reason why a designer couldn't have created an entirely different hole for the baby to come out of, which of course would necessarily mean that we would have an entirely different anatomical system for having sex in the first place. But instead of intelligent design, I have to conclude that any creative act on God's part involves setting up the universe with specific laws and forces and physical constants that would eventually evolve on its own to produce life as we know it, and that the blind forces of physics and biology and nature landed on a system, a solution that works most of the time, but sometimes fails horribly.
It's interesting you bring this up, because I have, as we are speaking today, I have a friend in labor, who's going through this very thing, and it looks like it's going to be a very long one and very challenging. So, and of course, I have three kids. So, yeah, it's a dirty business, this whole labor thing. It's not a pretty thing. And when you think, until relatively very recently, it was a real life and death thing.
Totally.
My father's a pharmacist, and he collects some antiques from old drugstores, and he has a box of these prescriptions, about 100 years old. And he was reading some to me one day, and there's this letter from a woman to this pharmacist in there, begging him for a particular substance, and I forget what it was called, but it basically induced an abortion. And she was begging him because she had like 6 or 7 kids, and she was quite convinced this one would kill her. But so she was begging this for, and please, don't tell my husband, don't tell. And I just think of, wow, how horrific that is, that women were faced with this kind of a situation where birth was a life and death,
right?
And even though, and we've mitigated that, of course, with modern medicine quite a bit, and of course, by having the reproductive system with alongside the the waste removal system, that causes problems too. I mean,
Totally.
women get all kinds of UTIs,
Right.
and men can get UTIs, and of course sexually transmitted diseases and things like that. So yeah, exactly what you're saying. This doesn't appear to be something that if you and I were sitting down coming up with a reproductive kind of design, that this is maybe the way we would do it. Now, of course, I know the pushback from the ID people, intelligent design people. They would say, well, we're putting ourselves in the place of God. Maybe there's reasons for this design that we don't know of. And okay, fine. But then you're kind of proving my point then, because you're kind of saying it doesn't really look like a good design. You're kind of agreeing with that, but saying that God's thoughts are above our thoughts, kind of thing. But
Right.
so I don't think that's a particularly good argument. But
To me,
yeah,
it just says that intelligent design brings up such horrible problems that I don't see it as a solution. Why would
yeah,
God do that? It doesn't make
yeah,
sense. And we can
yeah,
laugh at it. But
yeah,
then if you think about what comes after that, well, now, the semen went in, the baby has to come out. And that design is just
yeah.
horrible.
Yeah, it's like Henry Ford building the car in and this is true, by the way. I've seen it in Detroit. The garage that he built the car. He built this car in the garage. He couldn't get out of the garage. He had to destroy the he had to destroy the garage because he built the car in there. But when it was built, the door wasn't big enough to get the car out. I don't know what point in the process he figured that out, but that's kind of exactly what you're talking about, right?
Okay, I get it. Okay,
Yeah.
let's switch directions. There are also lots of
Mm-hmm.
biblical counter arguments for how this or that form of sex is so negative. And let's talk about a few of those. But first, let me be clear. I do fully think that we need some kind of limitations on our sexuality, just like we need limitations on how much we eat. There's all kinds of examples of too much of a good thing being bad for you. But
Mm-hmm.
some of those counterarguments against this or that form of sex are just flawed and indefensible, and I'd rather have a good and well reasoned one if I'm going to be so countercultural. Some of these counterarguments that we've talked about, we have talked about in the past 4 episodes, but there are others that we didn't really get into. One of them that always comes up when evangelicals talk about porn or masturbation, they'll quote Jesus saying basically, if you imagine it in your head, then you've already committed adultery. And for two reasons, I think this card is really overplayed. And the first reason is this: Jesus is talking here about marriage in a traditional Jewish context. If you look at his wording, he's clearly talking about a man doing the imagining, it says in his heart, while looking at another woman, and then he equates that right away to adultery. Adultery relates to marriage. Committing adultery can only happen in the context of a marriage relationship. People who aren't married can't be guilty of adultery, whether it's imagined or in real life. Jesus could have said that this lust desecrates the temple in your mind. He could have said it pollutes your soul or it stains your heart, but instead, he referred to a man breaking a marriage vow, a commitment made in a marriage agreement. So the man doing the imagining has made a vow of commitment to one particular woman, his wife, and if he even just thinks about it with another woman, right away, he's now already broken that vow.
Yeah, that's a really over and misused verse,
Yeah.
because aside from your point about the adultery thing, which is very interesting, by the way, I hadn't thought of it from that angle before, but that's a very interesting angle. But apart from that, even Jesus is not equivocating the two. He's not saying that lust equals adultery. He's not saying you've committed adultery. He says you've committed adultery in your heart. And if you read the rest of the Sermon on the Mount contextually, the whole Sermon on the Mount is about external versus internal,
Right.
right? The fact that just because you don't externally act on something doesn't mean that you don't harbor it,
Right.
right? So you might not kill somebody, but you may hate them, right? And that's a form of murder in itself. But nobody would say for a second that hating somebody is actually killing them. Otherwise, a lot of people would be in jail. So yeah, it's very misinterpreted and misused and for young men in particular. And again, I can only speak as a man, but I'm sure it's just as true of young women, especially during their sexual development. The abuse of that can be so harmful because who doesn't have these thoughts, and who doesn't have these urges
Right.
and so on. So, and this can become used as a real cudgel,
Totally.
particularly the masturbation issue. I mean, certainly I think this has changed quite a bit, but when I first became an evangelical, and that's like, 30, 40 years ago, the issue of masturbation, I mean, that it was very considered it was a no-go, right? It was sinful and wrong. And so you had just a ton of teenagers just living in constant guilt.
Yep.
And yeah, that's very unfortunate. But I do think the situation on that has gotten a lot better.
Right.
But yeah,
I was reading the news this morning, as I always do, and The Guardian is one paper that I always go through. And as it turned out, there was an article this morning in today's Guardian. So today is June 7th, if you want to go back to it. In The Guardian, there's an article basically about masturbation going back 40 million years. It was an article that was it didn't get into the details, but it was obviously talking about a study done by social psychologists who more or less they used the notes from veterinarians and zookeepers and other people who work extensively with primates. These people make observations and they talk about
right.
bimbos once again going at it. So they make all these notes, and these sociological psychologists then use those notes, and they use some genetics as well to basically trace that behavior back 40 million years.
Wow.
They trace it down through the various lines. Of course, humans are one of the lines of these primates. And so basically the point being, this is something that's been around for 40 million years. It's a completely natural behavior. We talked in one of our earlier episodes, I'm blanking at the moment which one it was. It was with Jordan Moon. And I mentioned how our own kids at 1 or more like 2 years old, they stumble upon it themselves. They'll just
Yeah,
happen to notice,
sure.
oh, I just touched something and
Yeah,
that feels good.
yeah, yeah,
We just learn that it's a natural response.
yeah.
So I guess one of the things I'm wanting to say here again, as I did in that episode, was what I don't think we should be doing is training our kids to immediately associate anything to do with sex with shame and guilt. Don't do that. Don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly don't do it in public. And all that shame and guilt and
Yeah,
condemnation. I think that's
yeah.
really been a bad mistake.
Yeah, it has, and I hope we are moving beyond it. I think we are to a good extent, but there's still it's still there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of interesting, that even that issue of shame and so on. I mean, even goes back, biblically. I mean, in the garden, have that intriguing situation where who told you were naked, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just that's fascinating to me.
Now, I said I had two reasons why I thought that card was being overplayed, where people apply that
Mm.
verse to porn and masturbation. I said there was two reasons, and Scott, you actually hit on the second one. I just wanted to emphasize it. In the same set of verses where he's talking about lusting in your heart, he says, if you get angry with your brother or if you insult him, you've murdered him in your heart. And it even goes so far as to say, now you're in danger of hellfire. So a lot of words to say, those people who are so busy pointing fingers at other people lusting in their heads, how many of them haven't previously been angry in their heads at some person or another, or even gone so far as to insult them? I think this is one of those plank in the eye moments. And I
Mm,
just have to ask
for
why they
sure.
put so much more emphasis on lust over and above anger.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's true. Evangelicals talk about all the time about how sin is sin, no sin is worse than another, and so on. Well, okay, they say that, but I'll tell you, the sins of the flesh are talked about a heck of a lot more and
Right.
taken a lot more seriously than I have never seen anybody hauled up before a church and accused of, hating their brother, or
Yeah.
those kind of things, right? But I've seen people, on adultery issues and things like that. So we do see them as, and in a discussion recently I had with somebody, they did mention one thing. Paul talks about sins of the body being different, and I think there is a difference, but different doesn't necessarily mean better or worse
Right.
either. So anyway,
Okay.
go ahead.
All right. So that's one common argument that people make when justifying a certain moral position about sex. Here's another one I wanted to talk about, this counter argument that I think just needs to be thought through a little bit more carefully. And again, to reiterate what I said earlier, I'm not speaking against them. I'm just saying we need to use these arguments carefully. We have to think about what we're saying because a lot of times we're just misapplying things.
Yeah.
And here's a perfect example. Christians will often point to Matthew chapter 19, which has Jesus quoting from Genesis 2. So again, pointing back to the first 5 books of the Bible. They use that as their proof text for normativity of heterosexual monogamous marriage. But if you ask me and many other people, their logic is flawed in two fundamental ways. And the first one is very easy. They see this referring to Adam and Eve, the first couple that God himself created, and who were setting the pattern for all humans who would follow after them. But Jesus was not referring to Adam and Eve. He said that the man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. Adam didn't leave his father and mother. He didn't have a father or a mother. So Jesus or the authors of Genesis are not talking about a real Adam or a real Eve.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point that I hadn't. Again, I give you credit for seeing the detail because I just a lot of people, I guess, do have always assumed that this was referring to Adam and Eve. It's certainly the creational statement, and that's the crux of
Sure.
it, right? That people will say, well, this is the order of creation, and therefore, particularly with the same-sex issue, they'll argue that it's going against the order of creation. I think there are arguments that deal with that we won't go into now, but yeah, that's the crux of the issue, is that there is a certain normality, or something God has baked into the creational order, certain sexual practices, and to violate them is to go against the creational order, which of course Paul in Romans seems to be hitting at that as well.
Right. Okay. So then that's Paul. I'm dealing with this one
Yeah,
passage.
I
I want
know,
to
I know.
address this one argument that people always, it seems to me, it always comes up on the table, and
Right.
people see that as prescriptive for normativity, and I disagree. And I gave that one reason to say that it's not Adam and Eve, but here's the second reason that's more to the point.
Okay.
These people see this passage as entirely ruling out homosexual relationships. But
Hmm.
Jesus wasn't answering a question about homosexuality. And
No,
it wasn't a question about marriage. They weren't
no.
asking him, what's the only way for humans to be married? They were asking him about divorce. How do you split a married couple apart? And
Right,
so Jesus was addressing the concept that a marriage between two people produces one flesh. There's that phrase
right,
that I still don't quite understand. And Jesus was telling them, it's like asking, how do you rip somebody's right arm and right leg off in order to make two different people? And he's saying, you just can't do that. It doesn't work. He was
right.
telling them they were making a category error. It's not
Yeah,
a question of whether divorce is okay or not, but instead challenging the premise that it's even possible to
right,
completely separate a married couple. You'll still always be attached in one way or another to your spouse.
right.
And to an analogy that I thought of, it's like asking your financial advisor, "What's a guaranteed way to double my investment value in 1 year?" If he's a reputable advisor, he's not going to give you a straight answer. He's probably not going to say anything else. He says, "Look, I can't answer
Yeah,
that."
right.
And it's the same thing here in his first century Jewish society, in Jesus' society. The two people who got married and became one flesh would have been of different genders, a man and a woman. There was no such thing as a same sex couple in their worldview. And he wasn't addressing that aspect of the question. He was addressing whether divorce is even something you can talk about.
I agree with that. I mean, yes, I know. Some will argue, well, all you said is true, but Jesus is still establishing a creational kind of order to things, even though, yes, he's not directly talking about that's not the subject of this, but it underlies what he's saying.
Well,
It
you're
forms the
saying
premise.
sorry to interrupt, but you say he's
Okay,
setting a creational point of view because he talked about in the beginning he made the male and female. Yes, but think of it this way. In the beginning, before you have this one flesh that was created by a marriage contract, before you had this one flesh, there was male and female, and now you can't rip it apart. You can't
right.
pull this thing apart. So this question about divorce doesn't make sense.
No, I agree with that. And remember that the main issue at hand here is the ease of divorce as it had become in Jesus' own day, right? People were divorcing, it was taken lightly. It was, if she's not a good cook, divorce her kind of thing, that whole attitude. And it was, of course, typically a male dominated kind of thing,
Right.
and that's what's being addressed there. So I agree. It doesn't impinge particularly on the issue of same-sex relationships. And just because he's talking about heterosexuality here doesn't exclude other things. Yeah, in his own day, that was the only kind of situation that was thought of in that culture.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's exclusive. The text doesn't say that. So yeah, at the end of the day, you're bringing a lot into the text than you're pulling out of it. When
Exactly.
you try to make it address things like same-sex marriage and so on, I don't think it's a good place to go. Yeah,
Right. And I want to clarify that one point that you made about how divorce was viewed in that society at that time,
yeah.
because some listeners may not know this. So let's
Mm,
talk about that briefly. This question that they were asking him, they weren't curious about marriage. They weren't curious really about divorce.
no.
They were trying to trap him. There was a
Yeah,
motive going on here.
yeah.
They were trying to trap him between two schools of rabbinic Jewish thought about
Right.
divorce. And on the one hand, you had rabbis who were basically allowing divorce for any reason given. And the joke that I heard which I think is more than a joke. I think it's literal. When I was in Div College, they were saying that there was even a clause in there, even if she burns the toast for breakfast,
Right.
you can divorce her for
Right.
burning the toast. Versus
Yeah.
the other camp, the other Jewish rabbinical camp, who said divorce is absolutely forbidden, is completely against
Right.
it. And they were saying, hey, Jesus, which side are you on? They were trying to
Right.
trap him. And he
Right.
was not going to align himself one way or the other.
Right.
He wasn't going to go for the first or the second.
Right.
Instead, he was going to redefine the conditions of the test, kind of like Captain Kirk in that Kobayashi Maru training exercise.
Okay. I don't know that one, but okay.
Well, I think many listeners do. And look it up,
Okay.
Captain Kirk
Okay.
and the Kobayashi Maru training exercise. It's a classic. It's something that everybody should know.
Okay.
Basically, you're given it's a no-win situation. You have to choose one or the other, and you're damned if you
Yeah.
do and damned if you don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Kirk came up with his way to basically redefine the test so that it wasn't a choice between two
Uh,
alternatives, and he went for the
okay.
third. So back to the point here, Jesus is saying, "Hey, look, I'm not going to talk about whether you can divorce for any reason, and I'm not going to go along with the whole idea that it's completely forbidden. Divorce isn't
Yeah.
even something you can do. It's like, how do you make water? How do you make water
Yeah.
dry? You
Right.
can't make water dry. You can't make a square circle. It's
Right.
just you
Right.
can't.
Yeah. Interesting.
So
Okay.
a- anyhow, I think we're beating a dead horse, and we really should move on. So those are three counter arguments that evangelicals often resort to when they come up with positions against sex. There's many others that we want to talk about, but we don't have the time, and we did do that in our previous 4 episodes, so I would refer the listeners to those. But I do want to get into one subject, Scott. This one was interesting. We did have two scholars come on. Stephen Simpson was one, and we also brought in Sarah Mosliner about a particular Christian cultural response, that whole purity movement. And Scott, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about your response to that topic itself, but also you got into a little bit of a duel with Sarah about whether her language is a bit too extreme, and
Mm.
she told you her
Yeah.
thoughts on that. So do tell.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how much of a duel. Certainly when I heard the term, I think it was kind of a communication issue. When I hear the term rape culture, it brings up certain things in my mind that is really not what she was talking about. And so I thanked her at the time. I thank her again for correcting me on that, because in the context that she's talking, I agree. It's not hyperbole. The rape culture is very much a real thing because of the various things that we discussed in the episode. As I said, in my thinking, what I was thinking about more was this idea of toxic masculinity and the fact that on the extremes, there are people that talk about all men being rapists, that's almost their natural state and so on. And I think that's extreme. I still do. And it's not helpful. When you do that, to me, you distract from what she's saying that's totally valid, that we have created a rape culture. We have created a culture where men are excused, right?
Right.
Are we? And that's in the process, I think, of being corrected, and rightly so. So
Right.
I'm glad that she called me on that and helped me, that we clarified that whole issue. So at the end of the day, I don't believe we we're disagreeing at all. It was just my lack of maybe nuance, or really my own lack of understanding what she means by that term, which
Right.
is crap. So yeah,
Okay.
so I think that
And
was
it's
helpful.
interesting. It's interesting. We had a lot of listeners write in specifically about that,
Yeah.
and I think I'd like to read these out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doug was one of the first ones to write, and he wrote, "Your last guest did a good job making it clear that she was not using hyperbole." And he quotes her, "When I say rape, I mean rape." I think that was the most powerful moment of your entire series. It should be
Yeah.
expanded on. It's not giving in to temptation, it's horrific abuse and an endless denigration of women. It's a poison claiming to be God's will. We had another listener, David, write in, "I strongly recommend this episode. The linking of purity culture to rape culture in our society was very convincing and explained clearly in a way I don't remember encountering recently." Rachel wrote in, "I was so pleased when Sarah came back and course corrected that conversation. This topic has been one of the most impactful pieces of my deconstruction. It's incredibly pervasive in evangelical culture, and it's something I think people would be shocked at when their eyes are opened to it." And Cynthia wrote, in part, "I think the last guest pointing out that this leads to a rape culture within the church is significant. What theologies prop up and support this cultural view? How are these theologies misusing biblical text to create this harm?" And I just want to add that both Cynthia and Doug said we need to do more exploration on this topic. Any comments, Scott?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting that how much that struck a chord with people, and I
Yeah.
really rightly so. And yeah, I think it certainly could be a future topic to explore in a little more depth. It's kind of interesting because just in the last week, I've watched a number of kind of docuseries, one on the Hillsong mess, not the one that came out a few months ago, but a new one that I found very interesting. It was done by Vanity Fair, and they took a very different perspective than I expected on the
Hmm.
whole Hillsong thing. And that perspective essentially was exactly what Sarah was saying, that the culture at Hillsong fostered this abuse. And so that's quite an interesting series. And the other one I watched was on a recent one on the Duggar
Oh, yeah.
situation. And what was interesting about that ended up being very personal for me, because it really isn't so much on the Duggars, but it's a movement that they're very much a part of. And that is the Institute in Basic Life Principles. When it started, it was called the Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts, and it was headed by a man by the name of Bill Gothard. I was converted in his ministry at 16 years old. He held seminars all over North America. He was filling stadiums, like 20,000 people plus.
Right.
Very, very popular teacher in the 70s and 80s. And so this really hit home with me, because I was very much a part of that. That's how I came into this thing called evangelicalism. Before, I was raised in a very liberal setting in a very liberal church. So that was my introduction, and I soaked it up, admittedly. And so I would highly recommend that series to anybody. But both of those series really underscore this problem in evangelical culture. And we're seeing the fruit of that, aren't we? I mean, we're seeing it with people, what we talked about on that episode, people like Ravi Zacharias, who was a rapist. He was
Right.
an abuser. But there's a tendency in evangelical circles to kind of say, well, he's a guy and he has urges, and, he fell to temptation, but not call it what it was,
Right.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'll admit that I've had to make some distance myself in that regard over the years. So, yeah, I think that's definitely something that we might want to take up.
Okay, so we did get some more feedback from our listeners. One of the points that there was some attention paid to was the idea that values need to be biblically based. We talked to Stephen Simpson specifically about that and how that thinking is rubbing up against modern secular culture. And more than once we ridiculed, we questioned the claim that some evangelicals make about wanting to have a biblical marriage or to be a biblical wife or a biblical husband. And yet those people really have no clear understanding of what the Bible actually says about marriage in this particular
Mm.
case. And instead, those people are falling back on Christian tradition and Christian culture. And so that's where our listeners commented on that, the whole idea that it's not biblical, it's cultural. Rachel wrote, I was pleased that the conversation of the 4 episodes clearly demonstrated how cultural the evangelical response to sexuality is, as opposed to it being biblically based. And Cynthia also wrote, each episode builds on the one before in that at least the last 3 point out that the views of sex are mostly cultural and not biblical.
Yeah, those are good comments, and I think that it's true. It's the old thing about a fish would never discover water, right? When you
Right.
swim in a culture, it's very hard to have a self-understanding of that culture. Believe me, in 100 years, people are going to be looking back on us, and
Yes.
God have mercy on our souls, because I'm sure there will be plenty that they will just shake their head and say, "How could they have?" It's just a very difficult thing to do, but that's why over time, the church needs to listen to culture. One of the criticisms in a conversation I had not long ago, for example, on the homosexual issue is, are we just caving in? Are we caving into cultural pressure? Well, sometimes we need to cave in. In other words, it's very possible that we've been wrong in certain areas, and that by listening to what our culture is saying, we don't automatically blindly adopt it, but we listen to it. And we say, okay, have we been thinking wrong? Have we been biased, and so on and so on. And I think that's what we're going through in this whole realm of sexual ethics, is we're saying, okay, our culture is saying a lot of things, and we need to listen, and we need to come up, respond to it, but not react to it, but respond to it thoughtfully and carefully. And we won't totally agree, I don't think. It's unlikely that we will totally agree with all the sexual mores of our culture. However, it very well may be that that process will help us to fine tune and counteract and deal with our own sins,
Right.
which can be many.
Yeah.
And I think that's just been true over church history. You take issues like slavery, take issues like women's role in society and women's rights and so on. The church didn't have it right. And by listening to the culture and then going back and thinking through those things, came up with a much better understanding of what
Right.
God does want from us, So, yeah.
Okay, so Scott, as I often say, we are running short on
Yeah.
time, but I did want to cover one last point. And maybe I'll preface that with another comment from one of our listeners. Edward wrote, "Thank you so much. Great series. I've really learned a lot. Given that there isn't really much support in the Bible for purity culture or restricting premarital sex, why and how did evangelicals get to such a strong stance on this position? Was it just a method of control or making an in-out group distinction? I'd also be curious if you have more thoughts on helping people recover from this particular bad theology." And that's that last comment that I want to address. I don't know if, Edward, your use of the word recover was an intentional play on words, but that is exactly what this podcast is all about. We're helping or wanting to help people recover from evangelicalism, if that's what they need, but also helping to recover a good version of evangelicalism that's been hijacked by a bad one. I'm always conscious when we do an episode that's critical in one way or another about Christians or Christian thinking. I don't want to be another one of those many podcasts out there that just simply ridicule and criticize and tear down. I don't want to stop there. Instead, I want to look for ways to deal with the warts and blemishes in our theology. I want to be honest and say, hey, look, yeah, they're there. And then look for other ways to adjust our thinking rather than just taking the approach that a lot of people do, which is, you know what, because of this wart or blemish, I've got to give up all my faith. That whole baby in the bathwater thing.
Yeah. And so maybe from the comments from our listeners, maybe this is a topic that we shouldn't just dispense with quickly. Maybe we should have a couple more episodes, dealing with some of those things you just mentioned.
Okay, so we'll put that on the short list of episodes for next season. Season 4 is going to be drawing to a close very soon, and we'll look at doing that in season 5. But my desire to be a help rather than being a podcast that just criticizes on this topic, you can still see Christianity as being a catalyst for societal reform, but we need to do the work to put the focus on issues of poverty and justice rather than on sexuality. That's what evangelicalism was originally all about. And when I say originally here, I'm not talking about the 18th century when that term evangelical first became a part of our sociological vocabulary. I'm talking about the first century when Jesus first proclaimed the gospel message, the euangelion, the root of the word evangelical. That message was all about liberation and freedom and community and love and forgiveness. It was not about turn or burn or about shame and guilt and condemnation, and certainly not about God hates homosexuals. And you still can read the first 5 books of the Bible and see those as giving ancient Jews guidance on what to think about creation or about human sexuality, but also about how to sell your kids into slavery and what kinds of animals that you can eat and cannot eat, and about hair lengths and using 2 different kinds of fabric when you make clothing and sacrificing pigeons and goats on holidays. Those first 5 books of the Bible are descriptive of what ancient Jews thought, but we don't have to see them as being prescriptive for us today. We now have a whole new perspective on the world, and it's changed dramatically from what it was in Palestine 4,000 years ago. We can still think about what ancient Jews and early Christians thought about human sexuality, but we can and should complement that with guidance from modern doctors and psychiatrists, many of whom hold a Christian worldview themselves, and also guidance from biblical scholars who don't hold to an inerrancy infallibility worldview, simply because those 2 ideas are also cultural products and not biblical ideas. You can still see God as a creator even if you drop the idea of him being an intelligent designer. I just want to sift through Christian thinking to find the nuggets of gold and get rid of the crappy parts.
Yeah, well, to me, it's the ground. So for example, my dad actually turned 94 on Sunday, and he's still very sharp. And we often have discussions about issues of faith and so on. And he just finds it frustrating and just kind of quizzical why Christians care so much about these doctrinal things, right? Jesus was God, the atonement, all those kind of things. He sees that as completely superfluous. The bottom line is we need to love each other. We need to follow those kind of things, and
Right.
The rest of it, who cares? Whether we're right. And I totally understand that, and that is kind of the, in a nutshell, that's kind of the essence of 19th century liberal thinking. I guess my pushback is, because I'm not a 19th century liberal, my pushback is that it's great to talk about love and all those things, but is there any ground for it? Like, do we have any reason to believe that we should love each other and so on? Because if I were to take just a completely naturalistic worldview, I'm not sure I'd come to that conclusion.
Right.
So that's why I believe that those things kind of ground the other things, right? The reason I can believe in goodness and love and those kind of things is because I also believe that God has spoken to us in Christ, right? Otherwise, I think I'd probably be a nihilist. You'd have to ask our atheist friends why they're not, and I know some of the reasons they're not, but yeah.
Okay, so that'll be the end of this mini series. We had a lot of fun doing it. Many questions are left hanging, and they do deserve some episodes, but that may need to wait until the fall. So with that, I'm going to say to the listeners, thanks for listening. Tell a few friends if you found this useful. Pass it on. Share the links to this mini-series and to the whole podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, let's keep the discussion going.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.